unless the Russians significantly increase the forces that they're going to use or significantly improve the effectiveness of the tactics they employ, they're not going to be successful. Just for context, I remember, I think it was October 9 or 10 or 11, there was a video clip that went kind of viral on Twitter, and it was of a Russian mechanized column trying to maneuver on the southern flank to get around to Avdiivka. And I was looking at that footage, and it was pretty apparent that the forces that were doing that were not terribly professional, not terribly disciplined, because they were driving in a very tight formation while they were within the range of Ukrainian drones and surveillance. And of course, when you move an armored mechanized column, they're supposed to spread out so that they're not likely to get hit with catastrophic damage from a single thing. And one of the vehicles even fell off of a bridge into a reservoir because it was sort of a makeshift shoddy wooden bridge. But that tight armored column moving within contact of the enemy reminded me of those iconic shots that we got from the Battle of Kiev back in early 2022, where we saw lots of Russian tactical mistakes, maneuvering in ill-advised formations while in contact with the enemy and that sort of thing. And here we are, almost 2 years later, and Russian units apparently at the tactical level still have not learned their lessons. They've still not managed to move in doctrinally sound tactical formations for basic maneuvers and assaults.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking again to George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, who've become a leading authority on the war in Ukraine with their maps and analysis on the progress of the conflict. George is the Geospatial Intelligence Team lead and is a senior analyst on Russia and Ukraine portfolio. George, once again, thank you for joining us on Frontline.
Thank you so much for having me, James. It's always a pleasure.
We're going to talk today about the Ukrainian city of Avdiivka in the east of Ukraine. And before we come on to the most recent developments, I wonder if you could just put Avdiivka into some kind of context for us, why it is so strategically significant and what has been happening up until now, because the fighting there actually predates the full-scale invasion of last year.
Yeah, absolutely. So Avdiivka is a relatively small town that's actually close to the initial front line that was formed when this war first really started back almost 10 years ago in 2014. It's immediately adjacent to the provincial capital city of Donetsk, out of which is based one of the main Russian proxies, the Donetsk People's Republic. And ever since 2014, the solid front line for what was largely a frozen war for the better half of the last decade was crystallized around that area there. So your listeners might recall the very famous Battle of Donetsk Airport that happened towards the tail end of the active phase of fighting before the ceasefire in 2015 took hold. But Donetsk Airport is sitting right across a couple of fields, and then right above there, you immediately get to Avdiivka. Avdiivka is important for a variety of reasons. It's a very well fortified Ukrainian position because the Ukrainians had such a long time to build up trenches and mine the territory. And it has a decent amount of overwatch of the surrounding area because it's very flat terrain, lots of open hills, not a whole lot of obstructions. Again, it's right next to an airport, so you'd imagine they want to have a whole lot of large geographical obstructions in the area. And it sits right next to Donetsk City, which of course is one of the major strategic cities that the Russians have occupied within Ukraine. The Russians seek to capture Avdiivka, number one, to get some more breathing room for Donetsk City, give it some depth. And then number two, it's an explicit campaign objective for the Russians as they seek to capture all of Donetsk Oblast.
It's interesting how certain locations take on symbolic significance. I've heard some Ukraine analysts argue that actually, even though Bakhmut has received a lot of attention, Avdiivka really strategically is of far greater significance.
I would agree with that assessment. Avdiivka, because of its proximity to Donetsk City, and also the fact of it's a very well fortified position. It's much more important for Ukraine for the defense of Donetsk Oblast, the province in general, much more so than Bakhmut, because Bakhmut, again, is just it was not an operationally significant town. It did not necessarily sit at the junction of several necessary logistics hubs. It was actually one of the series of fortified positions. And as we forecasted at the Institute, after the Russians took Bakhmut, they were not going to be likely to use that as any means to unhinge the Ukrainian defense or use it as a springboard to move forward. But if the Ukrainians were to lose Avdiivka, that would be quite significant.
So bring us up to speed, George, with what has been happening in and around Avdiivka in the last few weeks.
Sure thing. So around October 10, the Russians conducted a major attack, a major offensive against Avdiivka. They used at least the force of about 3 battalions, so almost a regiment or a brigade, to conduct an attack there. For your readers and listeners' reference, that's a much larger size attack than what we have recently seen the Russians conduct, just in terms of echelon and size, which indicates prioritization. We also saw the Russians use air support, so there were fixed wing and rotary wing helicopters and warplanes that were conducting joint operations for a combined assault. And then we also saw the Russians be actually defeated for their initial attempt. So within the first couple of days of fighting there, the Ukrainian defense in Avdiivka managed to repel those initial Russian attacks. Then what was interesting is around about 10 days later, around October 2021, the Russians conducted a second renewed assault, despite the losses from their first attack, which, as far as we can tell, did not go well also. For what it's worth, the Russians have not managed to capture a single village in the vicinity of Avdiivka. They've also not managed to penetrate very far. We've gone and measured what we can geolocate, and it seems that they're attempting to try to encircle it from two different directions. From their southern flank approach and the sort of northeast flank approach, they've managed to only gain about 1.5 to at max 2 kilometers in either direction. Again, mostly maneuvering across open field with little cover or concealment. So far, the Ukrainians seem to be doing quite well. And what's interesting about this particular attack is that the fact that the Russians regrouped and then with a reinvigorated assault attempted to attack again, despite pretty heavy losses for the first one, suggests that the Russians are again falling back into the modus operandi of the head of their general staff, Valery Gerasimov, which is you have to make progress regardless of the cost. You have to sustain, extremely costly attacks regardless of the costs. And it seems that the general staff might be forcing local forces on the ground to make militarily unsound decisions at the expense of, the optics of we're conducting more attacks or we've managed to eke out so many more square meters of territory.
And does that mean, George, we can expect these attacks on Avdiivka to continue despite their lack of success so far?
Yes. We assess that it's likely that it's going to continue. There's a great Ukrainian military journalist that I really respect, Konstantin Mashovets, and Mashovets just the other day reported that the Russians are reinforcing the Avdiivka area with additional units, and they're pulling more forces to that area. So the repetitive attacks, the indications and reports of more forces flowing into that area from other parts of the line means that we can probably expect that the Russians will seek to repeat and intensify attacks on this position. To be determined, of course, if the Ukrainians manage to hold it, but as defending forces and also as having been the beneficiaries of a decade's worth of fortification, they know the ground well. They fortified it. The Ukrainians have an advantage playing defense here.
Will Russia's strategy change in any future attacks? You mentioned they have so far tried to encircle Avdiivka. Will they change that? Will they try a different approach?
I suspect that they're not going to try to do a frontal assault directly from the airport area or the next city into Avdiivka itself, simply because it's mined very heavily. The Ukrainians have trenches and fighting positions that they've established and prepared. There's also, of course, the historic positions, and I think it would be probably easier to try to outmaneuver the Ukrainians' defense with a double envelopment with encirclement. However, I suppose it's possible that if the Russian general staff makes an executive decision, if Gerasimov makes an executive decision, okay, we're going to conduct human wave tactics to brute force tactical progress at the expense of tremendous loss of life and equipment, like how the Wagner Group did in Bakhmut last year, then perhaps they could replicate that approach. But at which point I think you'll be looking at attrition ratios and gradients that would be preferable to long-term Ukrainian success. The trade-off of small amounts of territory for tremendous equipment and force losses are that might be a worth it trade strategically.
And is part of the reason, George, that these attacks on Avdiivka are so significant because it's really the only offensive action from the Russians for months now?
Yes. It's significant because, the Ukrainian counteroffensive clearly did not go as planned. It did not go as the Ukrainians had envisioned it to, nor Western planners, for a variety of reasons. And really, for the last 4.5 months since that counteroffensive began, we've not seen the Russians undertake large-scale offensive combat operations. Asterisk, yes, there were Russian assaults in the northeast part of the theater at Kharkiv and Luhansk, but those were largely not successful. And those were the nature of that offensive has been much more persistent, small scale attacks in order to try to make gains. Nothing on the with the likes of which was a clear, rapid, major offensive at a higher echelon what they usually what the Russians usually use, combined with the support from air assets. So the combination of all these things shows that really this is a new type of fighting the Russians have not been engaged in a long time. They've not attempted an offensive like this really since the fall of Bakhmut back in May of this year. And that's significant because it indicates that the Russians have more resources. They've been able to successfully slow the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Not that it's over yet, but they also have enough resources to be able to attempt to conduct these offensives in other places. I think operationally, it's still a mistake. I think the Russians are likely prematurely thinking that, okay, we've defeated the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Putin, claimed that they defeated the counteroffensive on day one, well before that was even evident. But they have enough forces. They're now able to conduct these attacks, and perhaps they thought that the Ukrainian defense would be able to be overwhelmed with massive forces and a quick, rapid offensive, and that still was not the case. So operationally, it's quite good that the Russians conduct these attacks where they lose a brigade's worth of equipment in a matter of weeks. If the Ukraine can extract more of those sorts of fights and the Russians volunteer them, then things bode well for the Ukrainians in the long run.
Despite that, just looking operationally at the assault on Avdiivka, how would you rate Russia's chances of success if they are going to continue with the assaults?
I think if the Russians continue conducting what they're doing, they're likely not going to. They're likely going to fail. There's a reason why, if you look at the map and you look at the original 2014 borders of what the Russians held and what they have now, Avdiivka is interesting because it's right smack up against the original border, and it's actually managed to hold this entire time. Geography and interior lines in the Ukrainian defense really benefit the Ukrainians here. And so I think it's, unless the Russians significantly increase the forces that they're going to use or significantly improve the effectiveness of the tactics they employ, they're not going to be successful. Just for context, I remember, I think it was October 9 or 10 or 11, there was a video clip that went kind of viral on Twitter, and it was of a Russian mechanized column trying to maneuver on the southern flank to get around to Avdiivka. And I was looking at that footage, and it was pretty apparent that the forces that were doing that were not terribly professional, not terribly disciplined, because they were driving in a very tight formation while they were within the range of Ukrainian drones and surveillance. And of course, when you move an armored mechanized column, they're supposed to spread out so that they're not likely to get hit with catastrophic damage from a single thing. And one of the vehicles even fell off of a bridge into a reservoir because it was sort of a makeshift shoddy wooden bridge. But that tight armored column moving within contact of the enemy reminded me of those iconic shots that we got from the Battle of Kiev back in early 2022, where we saw lots of Russian tactical mistakes, maneuvering in ill-advised formations while in contact with the enemy and that sort of thing. And here we are, almost 2 years later, and Russian units apparently at the tactical level still have not learned their lessons. They've still not managed to move in doctrinally sound tactical formations for basic maneuvers and assaults. And so, I think it's a small vignette. I don't want to be too much looking too much at anecdotes, but I think things like this are positive indicators.
You mentioned a moment ago, George, about Vladimir Putin claiming that Russia had successfully defeated the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Is part of the reason why they are launching an assault on Avdiivka now because they frankly need a win, and Putin wants a win?
I think that's certainly one of the factors. Everyone is looking keenly at the calendar over the next 6 months because the Russian presidential election is coming up in March 2024, right around the corner. My personal opinion, I think it's very unlikely that the Russians will declare any kind of new mobilization before then because of the political ramifications that it might have for his election. I think the Russians need to conduct mobilization. They likely will try to avoid doing it until after then. And if the Russians can manage to eke out gains and claim that they've captured a village around Avdiivka, or for the Russians, better yet, capture Avdiivka or significantly improve their position between now and then, that will play very well into the Kremlin media apparatus and say essentially, oh, we're winning the war and everything is going well. But I will say that the war has become sufficiently, I think, sensitive within Russia that Putin is still trying to distance himself personally from the conduct of the war, because there's been enough war death and there's been enough people, men seriously maimed and injured, that Putin doesn't want to have personal responsibility for that. He continues to use his pretty shrewd political tactic of having a variety of scapegoats and fall men that he can sacrifice at the altar of political utility in the event that something goes horribly wrong. For him, right now, that fall man is Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. Previous fall men were previous theater commanders Sergei Surovikin, Prigozhin, and other such figures. So Putin's being very careful about these sort of things. And if it goes well in Avdiivka, I'm sure Putin will be the first one to claim I did it. And if it goes poorly, then that's all the fault of Gerasimov and the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu.
And if Ukraine are able to successfully hold off the Russian attacks on Avdiivka, to what extent do you think it is feasible that in the short to medium term they could then use that as a base from which to launch an offensive on Donetsk?
I don't want to forecast Ukrainian operations too much, but I think that's unlikely. If you look at the size of the forces that are currently engaged in the fighting there, it's largely an undertaking with elements of the Second Army Corps of the Donetsk People's Republic. So those are the proxy forces of that Russian political proxy, military proxy, and then some other elements of the Russian Second Combined Arms Army from central interior Russia. Not the cream of the crop, not the best units, and again, relative forces. It's larger than what they usually do, but it's not a tremendously large force. It's significantly less than what's conducting defense in the south in Zaporizhia against the Ukrainian counteroffensive, for example, and it's significantly less than what's currently fighting on the defense in Bakhmut. So I don't think that any Russian loss in Avdiivka would result with such a tremendous, again, unless the Russians reinforce it and the stakes are much higher. I don't think that it would pretend that it'll open up a huge opportunity for the Ukrainians to conduct an attack there. Point number two, the fortification sword cuts both ways. On the Russian side of that really very well fortified line within Donetsk City and the airport, the Russians have also fortified their half and their side of it very well. So it's quite difficult. And of course, Donetsk is Ukraine's second most populous city. It is very large. It's an urban expanse, and conducting urban operations, or even in a circle. I mean, Donetsk City is a very large city. It requires a lot of forces to be able to do so, and it's difficult terrain to maneuver in. So, fortifications notwithstanding. So I think the Ukrainians are likely going to continue pursuing. Their objective will be defeat the Russians in Avdiivka and continue pursuing attacks in other parts of the theater where the Ukrainians are most likely to have some operational success.
It's a really interesting point. I was going to ask you to what extent these battles around Avdiivka are a bit of a distraction from the Ukrainian counteroffensive further south in the Zaporizhia region.
Yeah, I don't think that the general staff engineered this attack as specifically as a fixing effort or a distraction effort to try to pull Ukrainian forces away, because Ukrainian forces are, I think, already stretched in a decent amount of ways across the theater. If you look at all the places where they're fighting, I think that this was actually an attempt of surprising the Ukrainians and making some tactical inroads here, perhaps trying to create some operationally significant inroads in the city adjacent to Bakhmut, Donetsk City itself. So not a distraction, but it does have the commensurate benefits of what a fixing operation or a distraction effort would have. I mean, if the Ukrainians do have to reinforce out of necessity, then that will necessitate pulling some forces from a reserve elsewhere or potentially from a different part of the theater that's already deployed and bring it there, which of course would thin Ukrainian forces more. But I think the Russians are currently they're holding their own right now.
And elsewhere on the battlefront, obviously Ukraine have now crossed the Dnipro River and appear to be holding some territory over the Dnipro River. How significant would you say that is, George?
Yeah, too early to tell. It's too early to tell. If you recall, your listeners might recall, there was a similar Ukrainian attempt at a raid across the Dnipro River back in the summer around Kozachi Lahari. I think that was an intelligence gathering effort. But back then, there was a lot of speculation about, oh, they've crossed the river. is this something more? Are they going to hold it? Are they going to build it out? Is there going to be a major Riventine, operation to try to get to the other side and build a lodgment on the other side? At that time, it was unclear. The Ukrainians completed their raid and then withdrew and fell back, and that lasted several days. Might have even been about a week or so. We're still now in the early phases, in the early days of this new confirmed Ukrainian activity on the other side of the river, and it's too early to tell what their task and purpose is. Is it a raid? Is it some form of reconnaissance mission? Are they truly seeking to establish some form of a breach, larger establishment of a lodgehead for a larger operation? For what it's worth, the Russians seem to be concerned about the latter. They seem to be concerned about a large operation. The Russians are reportedly redeploying some of the elements that are conducting the main body of their defense in the Zaporizhia Oblast. They're moving them to the southwest of there, to Kherson, in order to reinforce that area. Elements of the 58th Combined Arms Army. That indicates that the Russians see any potential scenario here as actually being worthy of significant attention and defense. So the coming days and weeks will be interesting to unfold and observe.
I just want to ask you, George, something that General Philip Breedlove told me on Frontline yesterday. He was talking about the ATACMS missile strikes that Ukraine have been carrying out on Russian targets, and he said that Putin inevitably would have to fold if those strikes continued. He sounded quite bullish. Would you agree with that?
I think I would agree with General Breedlove's assessment. Love General Breedlove. Talked to him a couple weeks ago. I agree with that assessment, especially if the Ukrainians manage to sustain an interdiction campaign and continue to conduct persistent fires. Because if the Ukrainians can consistently reach into Crimea and strike all of the stationary targets there, the dry docks, the ships, the command and control headquarters, the ammunition depots, the concentration areas, all of which are known and documented, by the way, not hard to find and relatively difficult to move, then the Ukrainians truly can make the Russian position in Crimea militarily untenable, at which point the Russians will then have to face difficult decisions about to what extent do they really want to stay there versus to what extent do they want to preserve their forces. And of course, I think we have some positive indicators in this moving in this vein, in this direction. Well, before the Ukrainians even conducted their first ATACMS strike, or it was even clear that they would receive ATACMS, the Russians began moving, not the entirety, but some of their Black Sea fleet from the main port in Sevastopol to the secondary port on the Russian mainland in Novorossiysk. They've not moved all their ships, just some. There were some premature reports that the Black Sea fleet is completely evacuated. But then, of course, there was the Ukrainian strike on the headquarters, and then now they have the ATACMS, which should improve their operational range. And I think it's very true. Key factor being, though, can they sustain it? If it's just, if the Ukrainians have a limited arsenal and it's not clear that they're going to be able to sustain these strikes and consistently maintain that sword over the Russians' head, then the Russians might be able to make the calculation that there's some combination by which they can last it out. But if we make it sustainable, then yeah, I think the position will become untenable.
You mentioned the Black Sea fleet there, George. I just wanted to ask you, we've had some reports overnight of another sea drone attack on the Black Sea fleet. Do you know anything of that? And also, how are Ukraine having such success, it would appear, attacking the Black Sea fleet, given they have no navy themselves?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this particular attack. It's early on my end of the day, so I've not read it yet. My apologies. But we know that the Ukrainians have managed to use, underwater drones, unmanned vehicles, and also surface drones to be able to essentially use smart torpedoes to get into the ports and hit the vehicles there. A lot of those are not successful, though. There's many attacks that are failed. I've seen lots of footage from the Russian border guards that show them on their little, skiffs and boats successfully interdicting these vehicles. But the thing is that all you need is a successful hit. If 10 are a miss and one is a hit, that's all you need, and you can do some real serious damage to a high value asset like a Russian warship. So, and of course, with the strategy with these drones is that they're relatively easy to proliferate and relatively easy to sustain compared to what it costs to consistently be on posture to defend your port and also replace or repair a ship if it gets hit. So I think that's why the Ukrainians are able to do so well. Is that they're smart, they're creative, they can find Russian weaknesses and exploit them, and they're quite relentless with using all the tools at their disposal.
And George, as we move into winter now, how do you see the change of conditions affecting either side?
Yeah, winter is going to slow operations. Obviously, the tempo is going to decrease as winter comes, and it's partially because of worsening weather conditions. Just everyone talks about the mud. We've a little bit, Western discourse on how mud affects tempo is kind of wrapped around the axle. Mud does not stop military operations. It does slow the tempo, but it does not outright halt it. So we expect that it's going to decrease. It will probably pick up again as we get into the depth of winter, as historically the tempo increases, and that'll be around January, February, and then it'll probably decrease again with the spring mud season as we get the thaw starting in late February and March. But the key thing is that the Russians are going to try to seek to use the winter season and the slowing of the tempo to try to culminate the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south, declare it decisively over, and then likely set conditions for the Russians to then wrestle the initiative away and launch their own major offensive. To be determined where that might be. For what it's worth, we've seen a lot of reports of a lot of Russian equipment moving to the northeast part of the sector of the theater, near the Kharkiv-Luhansk line. And some Russian military bloggers have referred to the logistically significant town of Kupiansk in northeastern Kharkiv Oblast as that potentially becoming, their words, Bakhmut 2.0. So it'll be interesting to see if the Russians try to do that. But fighting will continue. It's not going to stop. Ukraine it will need to continue to be resourced throughout the winter period. And that's that. And of course, I will also say one of the things that also slows down the tempo is not just fighting in the winter. It's not just the mud season or the thaw, but it's also just the economic and logistical cost of transitioning troops in the field from their winter conditions, from summer conditions to winter conditions. I mean, that is specialized uniforms, all the insulation that has to go into the field camps and the trenches, swapping out the special lubricants and fluids and all the vehicles so that they don't freeze and lock up in the winter, and all that stuff, and just all that additional work is it's a lot, and it's energy, it's resources, and that sort of thing slows the tempo as well. Besides what's happening physically to the ground.
And George, just finally, there's been a lot of discussion in recent weeks about the Dnipro River, about Avdiivka, about the weather conditions. Is there anything you're not hearing in the discussion around the war in Ukraine at the moment that you think more people should be talking about?
Yeah. We're in an interesting part of the war right now where I think a lot of people are looking at what has been, I think, a relatively disappointing Ukrainian counteroffensive. Did not go as well. The plans didn't survive first contact with the enemy for a variety of different reasons. And I think the problem is that a lot of readers and some policymakers, they're trying to live in this world of false dichotomies where it's either the Ukrainian counteroffensive is a success and therefore Ukraine can win the war, or the Ukrainian counteroffensive has not been a success and therefore they cannot win the war. Or another false dichotomy is, we either focus on China or we focus on Ukraine, or the most recent one, we focus on Ukraine or we focus on Israel and Hamas and Palestine. But of course, things aren't quite that simplistic. Just because the Ukrainians don't meet a certain tactical or operational objective where this current counteroffensive doesn't mean the war is over. I mean, there's branch plans, there's sequel plans, and your plans can adapt and adjust. And I think the key thing that people need to realize is okay, there was an underwhelming counteroffensive this summer. But that doesn't mean that actually this is a lost cause. It's time to figure out a way to settle this with a negotiation. It's actually, okay, all things considered, Western investment in Ukraine security has actually been pretty modest. If you actually look at the numbers hard, therefore the requirements for the Ukrainian victory that we all maintain collectively as our strategic objective, it's actually a little bit different, and therefore the support and funding and resource allocation levels for that must actually increase. So it's a slight thinking shift, but we need to start thinking really seriously about how are we going to treat Ukraine like a long war, because it's going to be a long war. This is not going to be over within a year. It's not going to be over within 2 years. and how's the collective Western alliance that's supporting Ukraine going to be able to juggle this with all the other necessary and real priorities that we also have in the world that are outside of Ukraine.
George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, always appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, James. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.